Opposition Leader's time has expired. I call the Assistant Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. It's very good to be able to speak on this important motion, because what the Leader of the Opposition has just outlined is his commitment to failure. And he attacks, for instance, those people who say we should have an international treaty that includes the world's largest emitters. Well, I can tell you, Deputy Speaker, I am resolutely proud that I want China to be part of the global solution. I want the United States to be part of the global solution. Heck, I even want New Zealand to be part of the global solution. And they all ran away from the Kyoto Protocol, and when it comes down to the Leader of the Opposition, he takes more of a Donald Trump approach to engagement in international fora than this side of the government, which focuses, this side of the chamber, the government which focuses clearly on how we bring the rest of the world to follow our leadership. And that's what we saw yesterday, when for the first time Australia had, yes, a 2050 target as a nation. Yes, we then had a time frame for the delivery of that target of net zero. But more critically, for the first time in Australian history, we had a comprehensive plan on how we were going to achieve it. And we're proud of that as a government, because what we have understood at every point is, one, that we take our approach to climate change very seriously. Two, Australians want action on climate change. But in addition to that, they don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want the government to burn down the village to save it, as the Australian Greens would have us do. They want to know that the government is on their side to work with business, industry and households to be part of the solution. And that's why we've taken a balanced approach and, more critically, taken an Australian approach, the Australian way to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, while also making sure we back Australians and their jobs. And I was only reminded of this yesterday. Late last night I did an interview on BBC World, and in a particularly shrill and hostile interview from an interviewer, they kept asking why I kept arguing for an Australian solution to this problem. And eventually I had to break it to her that in Europe now, in the lead up to a winter, there are millions of people in Northern Europe who live in a risk of high energy prices as they come up to winter, and that they haven't factored in the affordability of the cost of energy as part of their plan, and the very serious risk that Northern Europeans will literally die in the tens of thousands because they have not got access to affordable energy, and that is not our solution. That is not our approach, but it is the approach of one group of people, which includes the Australian Labor Party, who are more interested in cutting the emissions without consideration of the consequences than this side of the chamber. We're focused on what we need to do to build the future of Australian economy, cut emissions and be part of taking responsibility through a global solution. And we heard this explicitly today from the independent member of Warringah, who moved a motion to bring forth her bill. And what she said in that speech, I've got to say, Deputy Speaker, was profoundly enlightening and extremely disturbing. She said explicitly that the objective of her motion was to introduce a bill that would take the decision-making out of duly elected representatives. And of course I saw, as members on the other side of this chamber nodded along with the independent member for Warringah about that policy, because what they want to do is introduce targets in legislation so they can empower bureaucrats to veto the decisions of this very parliament. It is not something that we are ever prepared to accept. And we saw this again in the independent for Warringah's bill that she introduced last year, where literally it would have empowered the appointment of climate czars to veto the decisions of this parliament. There is nothing more anti-democratic, and now the Labor Party wants to do the same, because what they want is legislation that activists can use in the courts to override the decisions of this parliament, and we will not stand for it. We want to make sure we deliver a solution for the Australian people. And what matters in this debate, Deputy Speaker, isn't intent, it's outcomes. And without a legislated target, this government has not just reached 20.8% of emissions reduction of 2005 levels. More critically, The OECD average for emissions reduction over the same time frame is only 7%. So we're beating it by a factor of 3. But in the updated projections, again in the 130-page comprehensive plan re-released yesterday, we saw that the updated projection showed we'd reach a 35% emissions reduction by 2030. And at the same time, the Labor Party hasn't even got a plan. Let's not even talk about what you're going to legislate. You don't even have one, and you don't even have a target. How can you legislate air? Nothing. You've got nothing to offer on the other side of the chamber. And what we're doing is delivering that plan and making sure we cut emissions along the way. But this morning in the motion, when the independent member for Warringah wanted to introduce her democracy-attacking bill, we had the member for McMahon who came up here and attacked the government for exactly the same reason the Leader of the Opposition did just moments ago. Now, we all remember the member for McMahon from the last election, where he managed to elevate himself to the pantheon of Labor greats, with quotes like Paul Keating, who said it was the recession we had to have, like Kevin Rudd, who said climate change was the greatest moral challenge of our time, only weeks later abandoning his very commitment and his signature policy. Such was his commitment. Or, of course, Julia Gillard, who said before an election there will be no carbon tax under a government I lead, only to introduce one after she did a sneaky deal with the Greens to form coalition government. And before the last election, the member for McMahon was one of those Labor greats, and it will always go down in the history of quotes, that you're perfectly entitled to vote against us if you don't agree with our policy. Now, 100% right to the member there for Stirling. He remembers that moment clearly, as all the members on this side of the chamber do, because it was a time that the member for McMahon gave permission to millions of Australians who he wanted to push below the poverty line to say, don't vote for us, and we agree. Well, let's remember what the member for McMahon did before the last election. He came after Australian retirees and tried to slash their incomes by over 30% by the introduction of a retiree tax. Now, he failed. And we know on this side of the chamber he failed. But now he's come back with a vengeance where he wants to increase the retirees' bills of the nation, and particularly their electricity bills. There is simply no empathy or understanding of the impact of what he proposes on the Australian people, including some of those most vulnerable. And we see it very clearly in this chamber every time he gets up to the dispatch box.
The Assistant Minister will pause for a moment. The member for Wills is seeking the call.
The member for Goldstein is talking about economic policies that have nothing to do with this MPI.
There's no point of order. Continue.
I do thank the member for his interjection, because it shows how tin-eared they are of the economic consequences of their decisions. But what we know is the member for McMahon went after the incomes of Australian retirees at the last election and failed. Now he is doing what he can to increase the electricity bills of Australian retirees should they win the next election. Because at every point it's an assault and an attack that they seek to promote. Because what it does is it empowers the Labor Party at the expense of average Australians. That's why they want a legislated target. They want a legislated target because it gives them a backdoor to achieve every single policy agenda that they couldn't. And you just need to look at what's happening in the United Kingdom right now. Not just that there is a genuine threat with a tin ear to the consequences, the environment or the economic consequences of environmental policies that make sure that Britons can't heat their homes, but that activists are now using the courts to stop infrastructure development, the building of roads in communities and anything they don't like. And sadly, we've seen similar behaviour here in this country, where activists have sought to use courts to stop projects and stop development and, frankly, stop job creation in this nation. And we know they'll do it against many of the wealth-creating sectors of this country. And I'm sure the member opposite, who I've no doubt is about to speak, will be able to tell you how often legal pathways are used to try and shut down investments in Australian economic growth. Of course, she will run interference and defend it every step of the way in pursuit of their legislated target. But what they won't understand is the human consequences of what they propose. This side of the chamber stands by the Australian people. This side of the chamber seeks democratic endorsement for its work. This side of the chamber backs the creation of jobs, and this side of the chamber wants to cut emissions too.
Time has